Hello, hello. It is another lovely Tuesday night with the People's Pride Project, and you know what that means. We are on the couch. And tonight, I am on the couch with, I want to say it properly. Can I call you future Dr. Deja Jones? Does that work for
Yes,
you?
you certainly can. We claiming it.
Absolutely. Sociologist, yes.
Hmm.
Master's of Education,
Yep.
yes. I like the term wild keeper. We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Co-founder of Montessori Education, Honeypot Montessori.
Hmm.
I like the folks that do multiple things. So I'm very appreciative of you sitting down with me tonight. But
Yeah,
tonight,
thank you for having me.
absolutely. When we discussed originally the topics of conversation, and I heard alternative ecosystems for Black edu. I was sold. I was sold.
Yeah.
I was sold because the wording in and of itself, if you don't flip the switch, immediately your mind is like, what the fuck is that? But it
Right.
makes absolute sense.
Yep.
So thank you. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. And thank you for being willing to sit down and discuss these things.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Like I said, any reason to run my mouth, like I'm usually so quiet. I'm such a quiet person. But as soon as you start talking to me about education, black people, black culture, it's like you flip a switch and my mouth does not turn off. So I'm so happy to be here.
That's what we're here for. So, what in your definition is the ecosystem of education? Before we get to alternatives, where does
Mhm.
that sit for you?
I think ecosystem in its literal sense is everything that creates a habitat, right? And so when we're talking about the ecosystem of school, we're talking about all the things that create this institution of school. So we're talking about the student, we're talking about the teacher, the administration, we're talking about the finances, we're talking about the community that the school is embedded in. And so what are the parts that contributes to a functioning school body, whether it's the pros or the cons of the school body. So, what is this ecosystem that's creating this habitat for learning? And so, when I think about ecosystem, I think about all these moving parts that, or all these puzzle pieces that come together to create the bigger picture.
Okay. How does that work in relation to Black education? Or is it Black education in general or Black education in America? Like how does that work?
So I think in order to really answer that question, you really have to know the origin of America and education. And so I think what we've been doing now, maybe for like the last 5 years, and then more so heavily since the pandemic, is really identifying everything that's wrong with the education system for Black children. But if you're someone who knows the true history of it, you know that there's actually nothing wrong with the education system in America. It's created to do exactly what it's doing now. And so if it's leaving black and brown kids behind, that's very intentional. It's not unintentional. And so when we talk about like the education system, it's just the American education system, right? Because it was never really meant to include black children in the narrative. And so, when I talk about the alternative to these moving parts, I'm talking about a reimagining. And when I say reimagining, I want to put emphasis on because it's doing something over that's already been done, specifically for Black children. And so I think a lot about movements that have happened since the beginning of time that have centered Black children in the narrative of Black education and Black studies. And I think as we assimilate to American culture or a Eurocentric way of being, we forget a lot of those things that once existed that were specifically for us. And so that's really why I wanted to talk about the alternative ecosystem, um, as opposed to like continuing to talk about what's wrong with the current one.
Okay. So what I'm gathering from what you're saying is not necessarily okay. We already understand that the current one is trash.
Yeah.
Do we just scrap the whole thing and rebuild, or build a completely new version that returns back to the way that we best learn? Or do
Hmm.
we try to insert these things into the current educational climate?
So I think rebuilding, I think that's something that we've been doing for centuries. There's always been like a movement to reform American education. And so every few years with every new like presidential administration that comes through, every like public school administration that comes through, there's this initiative to reform something that's broken. And so the structural changes that people use to reform is not getting to the root of the issue. It's kind of like we want to take this thing that's kind of popular right now or that's buzzy that people are saying, and we're going to try to embed that into the curriculum, and we're just going to pile it on top of like what's already wrong. And so I think we've been rebuilding and we've been reforming, and we're seeing that it's just putting band-aids over open wounds and you're not really healing it. And so I'm one of those people that's for let it burn so we can do it again.
Hmm.
um, because we've been trying to like reinvent the wheel. And so, we've identified that there's a problem with public schools. And so the rebuilding was charter schools. And now we're identifying that there's problems with charter schools. And so it's just kind of like, when is somebody going to get to a point where they're like, okay, none of this is working. Like, what else can we do that's going to really center the needs of our kids? Because when you try to standardize education and you're trying to make it consistent across the board, you're trying to have the same education system for white children, black children, indigenous children, Hispanic children, then you're missing out on some rich cultural moments that could be had. You're missing out on people's actual lived experiences, because right now the complaint is there isn't enough black studies in school, and there isn't. But now there's this whole movement trying to ban critical race theory from schools, which isn't something that's explicitly taught in schools anyway.
Right.
But what people are really saying is that we don't want we don't want the true American history and what's happened to black people since the inception of America to be in our education system. And so I think it really is time to just do away with reform, because it's not working. And it's really walking into a space of liberatory education. And that's a path that a lot of Black educators have to walk alone.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, it does lead to being pushed out of school spaces. It does lead to being isolated because, now you're on a different wavelength, you're on a different path than the status quo. And it looks like you're not being compliant. And so that's kind of like, I guess that's my answer to the question. Like I'm over reform. It's like, okay,
Hmm.
we hear it every few administrations, we hear it, every other day, reform, reform, reform. But where's the change, right? Where's the change? And so I'm just for burn it down, let it burn, so we can like get it right, finally.
Which makes absolute sense. And along those lines of reform and working within the system, I think is where the hitch comes in. And you're
Mm-hmm.
right. Personally, me, I'm a let it burn type of person too. So I'm like, yo, just get rid of it. Like, forget it.
Right, like.
But a lot of times in the course of our reform, what we're finding is the same systems with brown faces.
Mhm.
So we're not really getting the level, or the rather the depth of understanding. We're not getting
Yeah.
the actual changes that we need because we're trying to play ball on a team that's not built for us.
Right.
So
Mhm. That's absolutely true, and there's, like, so many campaigns going around to hire more Black teachers, and I'm just kinda like, "Why?" Like, Why
Mhm.
hire more black teachers to come and work in oppressive systems? There is a really big like funneling of black teachers out of schools, and it's not like accidental. People have enough, right? It's just like, okay, I've had enough. I wanted to stay for the kids because these kids look like me and these kids are a part of my future, and I wanted to stay, but my mental health is on the line, you know,
Mhm.
my well-being is on the line. I'm working in a place that constantly has my back up against the wall. I don't really have like autonomy to like teach the kids how they should be taught in my classroom because I have to follow corporate curriculum written by people who don't even work in schools. And so, you know, it's like, yes, you want to hire more black teachers because you want to have that sense of relatability between the teachers and the students. And you want students to have like that representation of somebody who looks like them in the classroom space. But if you're not changing the issues that are at the root of what's happening in American schools right now, it's just going to be a revolving door of black teachers coming in and then black teachers coming out because of burnout or because of like just mental unwellness. And so I'm just kind of like, why hire more black teachers, right? To work in an oppressive system. Like change the system, right? Just change the system.
I mean, currently we're seeing a lot of issues in the educational system across the board, right?
Mhm.
With low teaching resources, low pay. A
Mhm.
lot of teachers, regardless of cultural difference, are feeling their hands tied. So,
Yep.
how does that get augmented, exacerbated, whatever, how does that get increased when it becomes a black and brown problem?
So there's a national teacher shortage right now, like in every single state in this country. Some states have gone as far as hiring National Guards to substitute. I know here in Jersey, what they're trying to do is, I guess, like not bribe, but they're trying to really like encourage teachers who are retired, who have been retired, to come out of retirement to teach, and they're promising that their pensions won't be affected. And so right now, we're in a very big space of like desperation. So it's like we're desperate for teachers in these schools. And unfortunately, the schools that are hit the most by this are schools that are in urban communities or low income communities that have a high population of Black and Brown children. And what's happening is that you're seeing like this influx of like white saviorism where it's kind of
Mhm.
like, okay, I'm needed here. Let me go in here and teach in this school because they don't have teachers. And you know, I just feel like if you're someone who's really for the job, it shows. Um, like right now, like being a former teacher, like I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I still get phone calls from parents of former students that I've had. And they're just kind of like, we don't know what's going on with the schools. Like the teachers that are there, they're so exhausted and burnt out that they don't even have any compassion or humanity for our kids anymore. You know, so they're talking to the kids any kind of way, you know, just being mean to the kids because they can't regulate their own like personal, you know,
Mhm.
issues. And so I think when we look at things like what COVID has done to our communities and how it's affected our school communities within the last 3 years, you can see a very huge disparity between the schools that are in low income communities versus the schools that are in more affluent communities. But then, even talking about those alternative ecosystems, there has been a very big increase in private school education. There's been a very big increase in children going to independent schools or Montessori schools or, you know, Reggio Emilio, all these like high quality methods of learning. There's been a very big increase in those spaces between white middle class families. And so that's even an issue of access because if something isn't working, people who have the means, people who have the privilege are able to then pack up and go and say, okay, this is not
Mhm.
working for my kid. I can go send my kid to this school, maybe pay like $1,000 a week to send them here. It's no sweat off my brow. But then when you have like Black children who rely on that free public education, it's kind of like, as a parent, what can I do to ensure that my child is getting a quality education in the midst of a shitstorm? It's like everything is on fire. My
Right.
kid hasn't had it. Just even this week alone, it's only Tuesday, and I've been substitute teaching at a school here in my hometown, and I'm substituting for a ninth grade biology class, and they have not had a teacher in months. They have not had a teacher, and so I walk into this classroom and there's no teaching going on, right? And so they give me the plans for the day, and they're just like, okay, well, the kids are just going to come in, they're going to get on their Chromebooks, they're going to open up their Google Classrooms, and there's like some modules that they can work on there. When they're finished their modules, we can give them a worksheet, and if they need help doing the worksheet, they can Google the answers for help. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm like, and I asked a few teachers, I'm like, is this just the substitute plans? Because in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm a teacher, and so I'm coming here thinking that even as a substitute, I'm going to still be teaching in some ways. And they're
Right.
just like, no, this is how the class is on a regular day. Like, so even with the actual teacher being there, that's how they run their classrooms. And so I'm just kind of like, what has schools become today where kids are coming to school just to spend about 99% of each class period on the computer doing online modules, and then that other 1% doing worksheets that was printed offline? And so is really how our schools look now, because people don't know what else to do. The kids are behind, like they're so uninvested in school right now. For them, they don't see the value in learning anymore. Learning is so hands off today. And I was just talking to a friend today just about how education technology is becoming such in demand. People want education technology in their schools, in their classrooms, and it kind of takes that heavy lift off of actual like teaching, like the art of teaching.
Right.
And when you think about kids' motivation, like their own will to want to do things, and their critical thinking, and just like their social and emotional developmental skills, it's like gone through the ground. It's not there anymore for them, because to them, they're just like, everything's on the computer, just Google, that's it, I'm done.
Right.
so
Right.
so to answer your question, it's really sad how the schools are structured right now in this space. And I
Mhm.
can't say that it's a black teacher versus white teacher thing, because from what I've seen, I think everyone is just done at this point, and there's just really no like room to breathe. Like, this is a career that you're passionate about. Like, being a teacher is very passionate work. You gotta have a lot of patience, and people just don't have the patience anymore. And unfortunately, it's in communities that look like ours.
So, number one, when you just said about the technology in
Hmm.
schools, that I feel is not necessarily the reason, but it's become a big crutch to allow for the dissociation that's happening in the schools,
Right.
right? Because you have these kids coming in, they're already attached to their phone every waking moment. So you tell
Hmm.
them, put the phone down, then you put them in front of a computer screen for the 8 hours of school.
Yeah.
And it's like all they're doing is changing location. Instead of
Yeah.
being in a house, you're in a different building.
Hmm.
But what is the actual goal of learning at this point?
Right.
Are we learning to just be good soldiers or good followers or good, you
Hmm.
know, office workers? Like, are we is our education system solely to be a cog in the wheel,
Hmm.
or is there a greater purpose for our education?
Right. And that's something that I was thinking about as I was sitting in that class. I have a 15-year-old brother. My brother is smart as heck, right? He went from being a straight A student to C's, D's, and like some F's. And I'm asking him like, well, what's going on with your grades? And he's just like, well, I don't see the purpose of school. School is just going to prepare me for a 9 to 5 to sit at a computer in a cubicle. And I'm just kind of like, well, he's not wrong in a sense, because if people are saying that your school is supposed to prepare you for the real world, and if all you're doing in school is sitting at a computer screen and you're doing your work on a computer, kids start to get this idea that, oh, well, if this is what the real world is going to be like, I don't want no parts of it. Like I don't want to just be here bored at a computer screen. And so I think what's happening is that, people are using technology because they feel like it appeals to a lot of different learning styles. And so, if you're someone who needs to see things in order to learn it, bam, you can pull up a video clip. If you're someone who needs to hear things, you can press play on the audio clip. If you're someone who needs more hands on and you have to like move the mouse around, people kind of feel like, technology is a means to reaching a lot of different like learning modalities. But at the same time, in my opinion, I'm just like, you should really teach the skill first and then use technology as kind of like that alternative. And so you should know how to write out a paper
Mm-hmm.
before you learn how to type it. You should learn how to like, just do science experiments with your hands before you're online just clicking and dragging and stuff like that. And so I feel like we've lost a lot of that, need to have our hands on things. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the reasons why I really love Montessori, is because Montessori, she believed in her method that the hands were children's first instruments of exploration. And so kind of like, like ants or like bugs, their antennas are like their first means of like communication. And so when a ant needs to know where they're at or what they're doing, they'll feel it around with their antennas. And so she believed that, this is how children use their hands, from birth. They're learning how to grab things and touch things, or they're learning how to identify the differences between things by using their hands. And as they get older, there should be more opportunities for kids to do more hands-on things. And so a lot of people think that Montessori is just preschool, but there's actually Montessori all the way up until high school, and it
Oh.
gets that much broader. And so when you're in your primary years, which is like around 3 to 6, pre-K, kindergarten, you're learning how to um, you're learning abstraction pretty much. So you're learning how to make sense of the world around you. You're learning how to be in community with other children your age, so your peers. So you're learning those social skills through hands-on activities. When you get to elementary school and then middle school age, you kind of walk into that service learning space, because around that age is when children start to get more curious about the world around them. And so now their scopes are starting to broaden a little bit more. They want to know, oh, why is my skin brown and that person's skin is
Mm-hmm.
white? Or they want to learn, why did the lady at the grocery store like do XYZ, or why is the sky blue and the grass green? And so, they want to ask those questions and they want to learn them. And so it gets that much more broader. And so now they're doing service learning projects and they're out in the community interacting with people in the community. And when you get to high school should be a lot more vocational, right? You should definitely
Mm-hmm.
be learning like life skills, world
Yeah.
skills. You should be coming out of high school with some type of certifications and licensing. And so that you can have a choice. If you don't want to go to college, you can have a choice to go into like the career world, and you'll have these licenses already. And so that's kind of how Montessori created her method. And she really looked at how children naturally develop. And for her, when she started her method, she didn't start her method with rich white people, right? Like she went down to like the slums, she worked with the poor children in her community, and that was kind of where her method was born. And so, even today, or even up until today, there have been a lot of freedom schools, schools from like the 50s and the 60s,
Mm-hmm.
that really were Black affirming. There's been a lot of Black nationalist schools, in Oakland and even here in Newark, Trenton, just a lot of Afrocentric schools that have really used Montessori as like that vehicle to really uplift children, to really uplift Black children, and to really like foster a sense of independence, but then also a responsibility in their communities within them. And so that's why I'm so like big on Montessori right now.
Mhm.
And so, just talking about alternative ecosystems, I'm thinking about spaces and places that really affirmed Blackness for Black children that
Mhm.
we really should get back into. And even like spaces that have had scientific healing methods. And so just thinking about nature education and forest schools where you don't actually see Black faces today. And
Mhm.
so, even then, there's a lot of micro movements happening to really restore Black children into nature. Because we are naturally people of the earth and it's where our healing comes from. And so, it's something that we really want to foster in children. It's like those conservation and those preservation of the land skills. We want to teach you land stewardship, how to grow your own food to feed your family, to feed yourself, and to take back that ownership of the things that you put in your body, how to work the land. We want to teach you how to survive, on your own. And these are the things that these Black freedom schools and these nationalist schools did. And so when I talk about alternative ecosystems, that's what I mean, like getting back to the roots. And I say reimagine because these are things that people have done already. Um,
Well,
and I think we can get there.
when you think about it, it's not necessarily reimagining when you think of it from that standpoint.
Hmm.
It's more so remembering
Hmm.
who we are and what we come from,
Right.
because these were things that you didn't have to go to school to be taught.
Right.
You know,
Hmm.
when we're living in small communities, we're living in villages, we're living in these towns, these close knit areas, everybody knew how,
Yep.
because that's what you did to get by. That's what you did. That was part of, your rites of passage. You couldn't
Hmm.
call yourself a teenage or a young adult or an adult if you didn't know how to do these certain skills.
Yep.
And it seems as though a lot of that, for a variety of reasons, has been removed.
Hmm.
And I think that is also what leads to the disparities in education because, like
Yep.
we said from the top of this conversation, we're being pigeonholed into areas that don't fit our flow.
Right.
Like
Yep.
that's not who we are. That's not how we move. That might work for y'all. And that's
Right.
cool. That can work for y'all.
Hmm.
But that's not where we come from. So we need to have educational systems and outlets that actually not even just cater to, but allow the space for how we work, how we learn, how we exist.
Hmm.
And what you were saying before about the hands, that's absolute truth. Like
Hmm.
even from birth, the
Yep.
first thing a newborn does is smell their hands, and that's how they find their mother.
Hmm.
So
Yep.
these sorts of things of the necessity for tactile learning and actually because even I'm a grown ass adult and I still take classes and I'm like, okay, so let
Yeah.
me touch it and move it and do with it for it to stick. Otherwise, I'm just mindlessly clicking. It's like, yeah, I got the answer right, but I don't know what the hell I'm doing.
Right. Yep.
So there's definitely those factors have to be reintroduced into our educational system.
Yep. Absolutely. Um, and you're exactly right. When you said that these are things that are natural to us. And I think for me, I really went on like a crusade during the shutdown because, there was all this conversation around, oh, well, the pandemic, children have not only summer learning loss because they're not in school in the summertime. Now there's pandemic learning loss. And I'm just kind of like, every day that a child is alive and breathing and walking this earth, they're learning something. You do not need to be in a four walls of a school to learn. And that's something that
That
we
part.
really need to like uncondition ourselves into
Mhm.
believing because learning is everywhere and everything. And I've seen so many parents really reclaim their child's educational experiences during the pandemic, where they were just like, you know what, I can do this better than the schools, and pull their kids out of schools and had their kids outside in nature learning during the summer or when the
Mhm.
weather is nice or even in the winter time, like kids outside learning. Parents set up pods in their households for their children to teach their children the things that they need to learn. And so learning, an opportunity to learn is every second you're alive. And I think that before integration, before schools were integration, I know people like credit Brown versus Board of Education for being like this really big victory um, in integrating schools. But I tell people like there's a reason why integration didn't happen the other way around. You didn't see
Right.
busing white kids going to black communities, right? And so, you know, you have these intentionally black schools where children are viewed as gifted, the smartest things in the world by their teachers who are also black, teachers who live in their neighborhood, next door neighbors. You know, you
Mhm.
got the community doctor who's coming in teaching kids science. You got the community preacher coming in teaching the kids choir. And so back in this time, you know, back during that time period, school was a community effort. You know, it was a community
Yes.
thing. It was not about a building. You know, kids were in basements learning, kids were in people's living room learning, they were in kitchens learning, they were outside learning. And so when you have integration that happened, now you got white kids. I mean, now you got black kids being bused to white schools miles away from their hometowns. The number of black teachers, like the percentage of teachers who were black, dropped significantly because they were not allowed to teach in these white spaces. And
Mhm.
now you have these black kids and these white schools with white teachers still teaching racism and still making black kids feel like they're second rate citizens, right? And so imagine the psychological trauma that a black child goes through as they're experiencing integration. You're going from this affirming place, this safe space, into this dangerous place where you're just not acknowledged as smart. And this carries on till today, right? And so now we have schools in black communities that are very low quality, you know, even down to the building structure, poor plumbing, the
Yep.
lunches are trash, you know, like every day the school smells like garbage because of old, you know, tiles, ceiling tiles missing. It's cold in the wintertime, super hot in the summertime and springtime, and you're expected to learn through that. But then you have language really ranking kids on how smart they are. And so you have kids in, oh, this is my low group, or this is my medium group, or this is my high group. And so you're subscribing to a ranking system based on the level that a child is reading. And then you're saying these things out loud to kids and they're hearing you call them L's, or they're hearing you call them high students or medium students, or you know, and it's just like, where's the high expectations? One, where's the affirming of black children in these spaces? And you know, where's the care? And so I just feel like we really need to uncondition ourselves from like the institution of school. And
Mhm.
you know, after I left the classroom, I was in this very dark place of like disillusionment with the education system because I had come out of a very oppressive year, and I was just kind of like, what am I going to do next? And so I started traveling and I started teaching people about the origins of American education. And the education system, like I said, was never meant for black children to be scholars or doctors or lawyers or anything of that sort. And you know, people credit Thomas Jefferson as like this father of education reform, but what he really did was create this two-track education system. And he said, this group right here is going to be for the learned. These are going to be the scholars, doctors, lawyers. And this group over here is going to be for the laborers, the farm hands, basically positions of servitude. And you
Mhm.
already know where black people and indigenous people, what category they fell into. And maybe it was about that 1% of black that made it over to the scholar side, because we had to have at least one doctor in these black communities so they won't be coming to white doctors. And so, you know, just thinking about that education system, just thinking about how eugenics was a very big part of keeping Black people separated from, the status quo, and then just looking at how these schools are situated in Black communities, it really like it's really an eye opener. And I tell people all the time, charter schools are not the golden ticket. There's a reason why there's only charter schools in Black communities or low income communities. I have not seen a charter school in a middle class white community. I worked for a national charter network, and the selling point for their marketing is always to bank on low income kids. And so I think that, these are some things that we should really consider when we're thinking about educating our kids, and what types of schools we're sending them to, but then the possibilities of what we can create together as a community.
Right. Along the lines of how we're deciding what schools our children go to, I think there is a large section of parental responsibility. Now,
Hmm.
I know we don't always want to like lump things on parents because we have enough going on.
Yeah.
But number one, I have been happy to see the uptake in Black and Brown people homeschooling their children due to the
Hmm.
pandemic and
Right.
recognizing that this is something that you can do. You don't
Hmm.
have to have, you don't have to have the doctorate and all of this to be able to just teach your child.
Exactly.
So I actually have a friend that is a Montessori homeschooler,
Hmm.
and you know, it's amazing work that's being done in the homes. But for those of us that, for whatever, cannot or choose not to do that, we do need to be aware that we have options in education. We have options in where
Yep.
we send our children. It's not just, well, this is the school that's closest to my house. They have to go there.
Hmm.
You have variety, and our parents need to be more involved in what our children are doing, what classes they're taking. I mean, go back to knowing your kids' teachers, not just the
Yeah.
name on the paper. Look in their faces, know who they are. Keep up with your kids' studies. Yes, it can be tedious when we're working and doing all of these things,
Right.
but you can't blame your lack of time and then say, well, why is my kid doing XYZ if you're not stepping in to help make sure your kid isn't doing those things?
Right.
So I think there is a certain amount of parental responsibility that's required in order to make this work. Like we always say, it takes a
Mhm.
village. It definitely does. We can't
Yep.
throw our children out to the woods or the nearest person and
Hmm.
be like, let them handle it, and then complain about when we don't get what we want.
Right. That's absolutely true. And, like you said, I always try to watch my words when I'm talking about like parent relationships with schools, because I know sometimes it can be a slippery slope, especially if
Mhm.
you're a parent who has a lot of on your plate as a
Yep.
person. And then, also parenting and then all the responsibilities that come with parenting. And so I always try to meet parents halfway. I'm just kind of like, if you can't come to me, okay, let me come to you and let's talk about like what's going on. And then also just from my experiences working in schools, although we do complain and we want parents to be invested in their child's education, sometimes we don't make our schools a safe space for parents to inquire about what's
That's true.
going on in their child's education. And, sometimes we're also just not transparent with parents about what's
Mhm.
going on in schools. Sometimes we just lie to parents. And so, I always try to make it a point to be truthful with parents about what's happening in the school day, even if it's news that the parent might not want to hear. But it's also, this is the reality. And, we can grow from reality, we can't grow from lies. And so, I'm always like on the fence about that, because it's like, yes, I do want parents to be involved and I do want parents to show up, but then I also understand why it might be difficult to do that.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
so one of the things with Montessori is, I've been having conversations with parents, is that Montessori is one of those methods that's easily transferable into the household. And you don't
Mm.
have to have a lot of money to do it. And so part of what I want to start doing is parent sessions and just educating parents around Montessori. And so just looking at things that you already have that you can use as a
Mhm.
Montessori tool, because a lot of like one section of Montessori is called practical life, and it's life skills, and you're pretty much preparing the child just to be a self-sufficient human being. And so some of the lessons can look like learning how to tie your shoes, learning how to wash dishes, learning how to use an iron and a broom, and things like that. And these are things that we have in our houses already. And so these are things that you can definitely do at home to really give your child that sense of autonomy. You know, if you're cooking dinner, let your child be a part of that cooking experience. If you're cleaning up your house on Saturdays, let your child be a part of that cleaning experience. You know, just anything that any responsibility that you have in the household, laundry, making lunch, let your child be a part of that, because that's things that are often mimicked in the Montessori classroom. And then things like math and language and you know, there's a section called sensorial. Those are also things that can easily be done in the household, because a lot of Montessori materials are handmade. And so, you know, it's just me wanting to educate parents so that they know they have an option, right? And so it's one thing to say, hey, you have an option, but not really giving them like the option. And you
Right.
know, Montessori is very gatekeeped. It's a very gatekeep method that is used like a lot by white people. And I'm just like, okay, I'm trained in Montessori. And so now I feel it's my duty to go back into my community and work
Mhm.
with families and parents and show them what Montessori is without them having to pay thousands of dollars to get the skill. And so
Mhm.
that's where I'm at now. And at least let them have that option.
That's what's necessary. When a lot of times I talk about doing the work, and it's not like it's some giant undertaking. Yes, it can feel very heavy, and it's like, you're this little boat out in the ocean by yourself.
Yeah.
We really have to go back to the idea of taking what we know and bringing it back and sharing and educating amongst ourselves, and not keep passing off like, oh, well, you don't have a right to teach because you didn't go to an Ivy League school and come back with a piece of
Mhm.
paper, or you don't have any knowledge to give because you only work at the grocery store. Like, we all have life experience, we all have
Mhm.
knowledge to give, and things that can be shared and should be shared to the next generation.
Yep.
So, going back to the idea of unlearning and unconditioning, because we really have bought into the okey doke that this version is better,
Mhm.
because that's what we were told, and that's what we were taught, and that's what we were forced into. Like,
Yep.
so many, the indigenous schools, and the, oh, don't get me started on history lessons,
Yeah.
but there's so many things that were strategically done to
Mhm.
disconnect us from our own learning styles
Yep.
and make us dependent and essentially crippled by the idea that white is right.
Yeah.
And however they do things, or however, the systems that are being set up in that vein, are the only ones that are legitimate. And it's costing us, and it has costed us for
Mhm.
several decades, if not longer.
Yep.
So the necessity to acquire and return is
Mhm.
beyond overdue.
Yep. Yep. And I think now people are really just looking for relief at this period of time with the way education is looking. You know, a lot of parents are discouraged about sending their kids to schools now. But at the same time, it's just kind of like I have no other option. You know, I work a 9 to 5. I can't afford to stay home with my kid and watch them during the day. And so it's like, what do I do? And one of the things that I tell people, start a learning pod. You know, a learning pod. Get somebody that does have the privilege of work from home, and just get together and say, hey, um, I don't want to send my kid to school. Maybe we can get together and create this learning pod together. And you might teach literacy.
Mhm.
When I come home from work and I have the free space, I can teach this skill to this child. You know, we get the next door neighbor in on it, we get the person down the street. And
That
so I've
part.
been seeing a lot of that happening during the pandemic as well. And even if it's one of those online type of schools, I've been seeing parents come together and just be in the same space with their kids and helping their kids through their learning experiences.
I also think that in that very same spirit of things, we are neglecting a very valuable part of our population,
Mhm.
and that is our elders.
Mhm. Yep.
Like, so much knowledge is walking around in these bodies that we take for granted, you
Yep.
know? So, yes, parents may not have the luxury, but now we have retirees, we
Mhm.
have grandma and granddad, we have
Yep.
um this generational availability, which is
Mhm.
what we traditionally grew up in. Like, you weren't a
Yep.
nuclear family of just your parents and the children. We had the
Mhm.
grandparents and the aunties and
Yep.
the uncles,
Yep.
and we all raised each other. We all learned together. So,
Mhm.
while that may not be an option for everybody, because nothing is a panacea for everybody, but I
Mhm.
still feel that we should be including this generation. We
Yep.
should be falling back to the elders and
Yep.
really, you've been on this earth. You
Yep.
have acquired some information, and really trusting
Very
the
true.
fact that they can lead these children while we are off working or doing whatever it takes to bring in, what needs to be done. And I think a lot of it, we've disconnected ourselves from so many, not just our generational living, but
Mhm.
our families. The idea, like, it's real heavy in our community. Well, you're 18, get out.
Yeah,
Like,
and that's a very Eurocentric way of thinking,
mhm,
where individualism is essentially American culture, right? It's this idea that once you come of age, you now become a contributing body in this capitalistic society. And so when you look at cultures like indigenous cultures, native people, when you think
mhm,
about Hispanic people, even Jewish people, and just see how like family strong they are, when the kids become of age, yeah, they make something of themselves, but they make something of themselves so they can come back and be contributing people to their families. And so I
mhm.
think that's definitely something that we've lost in our quest to assimilate to a dominant society. We
Yes.
want to be a part of this culture. And so now you have capitalism, but then you slap black in front of it. So now you got black capitalism. Or you got white elitism, but then you slap black in front of it, and now you got black elitism. And it's like, okay, at the end of the day, it's still capitalism and it's still elitism. It doesn't matter what color it
Mhm.
comes in. And so we've bought into this notion that in order to really be accepted by a white culture or a dominant society, we really have to play this game with them. We have to spend money. We have to fall into the lap of black luxury in order to be accepted. And we lose ourselves in that. Like we lose our strength, the thing that really makes us who we are, and that's our
Mhm.
culture. And so this is something that I've had to unlearn, in my late 20s and going into my 30s. It's just how things don't matter. When you don't have a strong value system, when you don't have a strong, cultural backing, when you don't have a strong sense of identity and where you come from, you really don't have much, like money comes and goes. You get
Yeah.
money, you spend it, you get a car, you trade it in for another car, you move apartments. These things are always changing, but what's not changing is the things that make you who you are, and those are your roots. And so I think that when I look at these other cultures and just see how strong they are and their heritage, and then wanting to pass that knowledge on to the next generation, is something that I really wish that we held strong to in our communities. And like you said, elders are very important people. Indigenous natives, like they heavily revere their elders, because these are the people who knows their languages. These are the people who know their stories, and the stories that, and a lot of indigenous cultures are also they also pass on their traditions through oral storytelling. And so if you don't have an elder there sharing these stories with you, sharing this language with you, then it's essentially becomes lost. And we were once those people. I
Yep.
think about the Gullah Geechee, and it's just kind of like, I wish I knew like what and it's like, because of my like proximity to that, I can pick out some of the things they're saying. um
Mhm.
but at the same time, just like, I wish that was like a really big part of me, being able to just sit and have conversations in that dialect with them, and
Mhm.
being able to like know that way of life, working the land and making these different cuisines and learning the stories and the histories behind these cuisines. And so as a 32-year-old, I learned these things through research, but it would be that much better if I was actually learning it from the mouths of
Right.
an elder, someone who's lived it and who's passing it on to me. And I think that's something that we really miss out on, and we don't value as much as we used to.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. I mean, that was that was our natural.
Hmm.
Whereas we're learning things, 20s, 30s, 40s, researched adults, these were
Yeah.
things that maybe a generation before us or two generations before us, they were learning, 4 and 5 years old in the kitchens with,
Yep.
you know, the loved ones. Like even growing up, I know I learned washing how to wash dishes standing on a chair in front of the kitchen sink
Yeah.
because these are just the
Yep.
things you were taught when you were
Hmm.
little. My dad taught me how to bake bread and biscuits and all of these
Hmm.
things because I was a little kid that wanted to eat. So he was like, "Well, you need to know how to make it if you want to eat it."
Yep. Yep.
So these sorts of things were our natural inclination to how we did things. And now part of it is convenience.
Hmm.
Part of it is uh I want to say lack of resources, but I can't even say that because those that came before us did so much with so much less
Yeah.
that we can't even actually say, well, because I don't have, it's
Hmm.
because you're in the mindset of that you have to have in order to get
Right.
things done. You know what I mean? Like some you don't need all the extra. You can still do it without.
Yep.
But one thing that you did touch on, and it's a little personal thing for me, is you said black elitism. And this could be a whole conversation unto itself.
Hmm.
But this idea for me, I know that black excellence is a lovely catchphrase,
Hmm.
but I really feel like all it has done is permeate the idea of elitism and just put a black face on it.
Absolutely.
It's just one more way to separate and divide and create a list of haves and have nots under
Hmm.
this new title.
Yeah.
So
And I forget what I was watching. I know it was like a comedy show, but one of the comments that was made was how elitism is or black excellence is another tool of oppression,
mhm.
because it puts so much pressure on you as a black person to got to be the first person to ever do XYZ, or like the second person, or even like with Kamala Harris, right? We were so pressed about like the blackness of it all, right?
Mhm.
She's a mixed woman, and we were just like, yes, we got the first black VP. Even Barack Obama, yes, we got the first black president. And it's like we've got to be first. We want to have so many firsts, and it puts so much pressure on us to attain that first. Like, what are we the first in now? Like, what are we the first in this? What are we the first of? And it just, I want to say, it kind of dehumanizes us in a way, because it creates this idea that until we become the first of something, we're not capable of doing it until somebody has landed that title of first. And I also just think about how, in my own personal life, just how burnt out I had gotten trying
Mhm.
to play this black excellence card, right? And you find yourself so many different like your hands in so many different pots, pretty much.
Mhm.
And it's like you don't rest. You got to be booked and busy. You got to be, you got to have multiple streams of income coming from like so many different places. You got to have like 8 side hustles, just to afford to have the appearance of. And it's just like that's exhausting.
It
And
is.
that's why people say that it can be a tool of oppression, because you can't be free if you're exhausted. You can't be liberated if you're burnt out all the time. And what you're really doing is fueling more capitalism. Like, you got to play the
Mhm.
capitalistic game,
Mhm.
keep it going. And we already know that capitalism is intentionally separates us by classes.
Oh,
And so
absolutely.
it's just kind of like, I humbly take my accomplishments and I make sure with those accomplishments, I'm giving it back to my community, right? Anything that I'm doing is for my community, it's for social uplift. And yes, it's to edify myself and to make sure that I'm able to sustain myself. But at the same time, I don't need a soapbox to tell
Right.
people like what I've accomplished or what I'm doing. And I think a lot of times we do that for the face value of it to kind of get this respectability
Mhm.
that we want.
That part. I think it also, I love that you said as it's being part or likened to a form of oppression,
Mhm.
not only because of the level of pressure that it requires,
Mhm.
but what is considered excellent is still what's most valued by the
Yes.
dominant society or under white supremacist
Yep.
terms. So, yes, it's black excellence because you're doing what the other has accomplished. You
Right.
know, not
Mhm.
just it's excellence because I'm a bad motherfucker by myself. You know,
Right.
that's enough for me, but
Right.
it doesn't attain that level unless you're mimicking the other.
That's true. And that's why there's so many unsung heroes right in our local communities that don't get the recognition that they need for
Mhm.
the things that they're doing. And there's people out here doing so many grassroots initiatives, so much grassroots work in their communities, your next door neighbor, people down the
Mhm.
street, people in your own neighborhood, and they don't get the brownies or the trophies that they deserve because it's not on such a broader scale. And so sometimes, like, if I like, even on social media, and I've been like guilty of this, I've seen someone get like serious awards because they got like 55,000 to a million followers on Instagram, and they're doing the same work I'm doing, and I'm just kind of like, so how do you like pick out what person is going to get this like accolade? And it has a lot to do with presentation. And so, yeah, I only have like 2,000 followers. I'm from Trenton, New Jersey. Like, who am I, right? But you got this person over here with a million followers, and they're doing the same thing I'm doing, just on a broader level, with more people watching. And so it's just kind of like, okay, like, is it really black excellence, or is it just you needing somebody to put on a pedestal as a representation of blackness in that period of time?
That
And so
part.
that's why I'm just kind of like, black excellence, like what exactly is that? We're all doing something to give back to our communities, whether
Mhm.
big or small. And so how do you even like have a scale to measure, you know, who gets what and who doesn't? And so that's why sometimes I'm just like, people be like, "Oh, Deja, you do so much." And I'm just like, yeah, I guess. Like,
Right.
it's not a big deal for me because
Mhm.
I'm not doing it for that, like for the
Right.
attention. And so I think that when people try to put me in like the black excellence box, I'm just kind of like, I'm good on that. Like, I'm just like, I'm good on it because who does it serve?
Right.
With or without it, I'm still gonna do what I'm doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like titles are great.
Mhm.
Accolades are fantastic. You know, you get those million followers. That's when people start paying attention. That's when you
Yeah.
get the sponsorships. That's when you get the invitations to speak and do all of these things.
Yep.
But a lot of the time, like you said, it's presentation. You know,
Mhm.
it's not necessarily going to the one that's actually doing the work. It's
Right.
not actually got the feet on the ground, you know, really hands in the dirt. It's the figureheads. It's
Mhm.
the ones that fit what diversity should look like, or, you
Right.
know, the ones that'll look good on the poster. And
Exactly.
the actual work gets lost
Mhm.
in trying to fit into this box of what's acceptable.
Right.
And I know for me in my project, I intentionally do some shit that I know is not acceptable.
Mhm.
Just listen, you ain't got to like me.
Right.
Like I'm here for a whole other reason. So, and I think that's what makes it dynamic. If I'm going to call Black excellence, it's those people that aren't afraid to go flip some tables and shake
Right.
shit up. And
Mhm.
that's what I want to see. That's what I want for our communities, that we're no longer just following this status quo that was never ours to begin with.
Yep.
Shake shit up. Don't be
Yep.
scared to be the one out
Mhm.
there on the mountain, loud as hell,
Right.
doing what you
Right.
got to do.
Yep.
So,
And that's where that alternative ecosystem comes in. Because like I said, it's very isolating, like when I started the groundwork for building Honeypot, um I was trying to look for a co-founder, and it was a very long journey trying to find a co-founder because people were not buying into the vision of what the school could be. And I'm telling people, oh, listen, like I'm starting this Afrocentric Montessori school with a nature foundation to it. The kids are going to learn gardening, they're going to learn African principles, and people were just kind of uh, like some questions I've had is, so what about standardized testing? And I'm like, there's no standardized testing in Montessori, right? Like you children learn mastery by practice. And
hmm
so, and then it's also like, well, I want to make $90,000. And I'm like, this is a Montessori school. Like this is not like a Fortune
right.
500 company. Like, why are you trying to pitch a $90,000 salary? And so I feel like we get so conditioned into, a dominant society. We want
Mhm.
standardized testing. We want disciplinary policies. We want astronomical salaries. We want so that we can afford luxury, like in the elitist sense of luxury.
Yep.
And people weren't really seeing the vision of like what Honeypot could be. And so I'm grateful I have a partner now, and she gets it. We're on the same page. But at the same time, just that little example, it speaks to a broader experience in our community, is how
Mhm.
sometimes we have to see it to believe it. But then it's also just like, well, why can't you imagine it, right? Like why can't you have an imagination that's radical enough to dream up something
Right.
that can be very transformative for our communities. And so it's very isolating, like you'll find yourself by yourself most of the
Mhm.
time. You'll find yourself have to explain yourself a lot to people who can't see the vision. And
Yep.
so, when I talk about alternative ecosystems, that's kind of like my platform. Like I'm going into communities that look like mine, and I'm telling them public schools, they're good, right? They're free, you don't pay for them. It's what we've been going to. I went to public schools as a kid growing up, but
Mhm.
that's not the only option. Charter school is not the only option. There are other options, and it's been done before and is currently being done in a lot of different places. And so it's just me trying to get people with the program and really reclaiming like our children.
And that's what it is. That's
Mhm.
what's I can't really say it better than that. But when I get into conversations like this, mm, it always reminds me. I don't think when my dad told me this growing up, he thought it would make any sort of impact. But like decades later, I'm still remembering this one thing, right? He always said, he used to teach me to play basketball, and he used to say, be so good at playing your game
Mhm.
that they can't beat you unless they play your game too.
Yep.
You know?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I feel like we have to go back to that idea that we're so good at what we do because it is what we do. Not
Mhm.
this aspiration of excellence for platitudes, but because that's who we are and that's what we do, that no one can come up against or do anything in a negative sight unless they learn to do it our way. That's
Yep.
essentially how we got played in the first place.
Yep.
So,
Yep. Yep.
you know, play it so well that they can't beat you unless you play it. They play it your way too.
Mhm. Yeah. Yep, yep.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's very frustrating to me now, like being in this environmental education space, is because I know it is indigenous to our culture, like being
Mm-hmm.
people of the land. and indigenous natives. We learned it from them, we taught it to them, we had a relationship with indigenous people and land conservation. But agriculture and environmental studies is so white right now. Like, it's so white.
Hmm.
Farming, like even urban farming, very white. And we got all these farming coalitions, these nature coalitions of white people using practices that were taken from us. And so it really, it's like you said, we have our own, but then we teach it, we give it away, we don't cherish it, and then we lose it, and we lose the game that we created by other people. And so, yeah, it's about reclaiming spaces,
Absolutely.
reclaiming our time.
But that is why we are fortunate, our communities are fortunate to have people like you that come in and do what you do and are so passionate about the work that you're doing.
Mhm.
And it's like, I'm not doing this for shits and giggles. I'm not doing
Right,
this, it's nice that people mention my name, but that's not what this is about. So
right.
I truly appreciate the work that you're doing, and thank you for being willing to challenge what has been seen as the norm, what has been created to be the norm. Because if
Mhm.
no one ever challenges it, we don't get any better, we don't move forward, and we
Right.
stay
Yep.
churning the wheel.
Yep. Yep.
So I only hold folks hostage for about an hour. And
Yeah.
then
Like, conversations like this can go on for like 3-4 hours. Like, if you let
absolutely.
it. So you definitely gotta like put the cap somewhere. Like,
Listen, if people want to talk, we will talk. We can talk elsewhere. We can collaborate with the
mhm.
project and what you're doing.
Yeah.
This is for the people. We're
Mhm.
here to help. We're here to grow. We're here to remember and rebuild. And it's so
Absolutely.
necessary. So I thank you for taking the time to sit down with me. I would love to actually, again, take some time, come up with some collaborative things that we could
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
and really make it happen.
Yep.
So
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me on here. Let me run my mouth because I love to run my mouth. And so, yeah, thank you so much.
you're very, very welcome. Well, people, this has been another Tuesday night on the couch with the People's Pride Project. If you didn't catch it, I'm going to throw it up on the screen one more time where you can find Deja and all of her information. We didn't even really talk about, your nature programs and all these other things that you're doing. She's doing a lot. She's worth a follow. Stay in contact. And we'll see you next week. Bye.
Yay.